All right, Soulframe. I've been keeping my eye on this one since it was first revealed a couple years ago. It's the new upcoming game from Warframe developer Digital Extremes. I've had a lot of hope for this title as someone who's played Warframe on and off over the years, starting when it first entered beta way back in 2013. Watching that game evolve and grow, seeing how they've supported it over time, continuously adding new content for free, and probably most importantly, just the fact that whenever I revisit the game, I have a good week or two of fun checking out all of that new free content. Outside of a few long-standing MMOs, Warframe has been one of the most consistent games providing me entertainment over this past decade. So when they announced that they were making a new game that was sort of like the inverse of Warframe in terms of its tone, setting, and gameplay, while still also leaning into their strengths as a developer, yeah, that got me interested. You'll no doubt see and feel some similarities between the two. There is certainly visual and style through lines, but there's also quite a bit different. Warframe is sci-fi, Soulframe is fantasy. Warframe is a lobby-based multiplayer game. Soulframe will be more open, shared world, almost MMO-lite. Warframe's combat is fast-paced, twitchy, and focused on shooting, whereas Soulframe's combat is going to be slower, more heavy, and focused on melee and magic. And topping it all off is the fact that Soulframe leans into this whole like one with nature, friends of the animals, Princess Mononoke-inspired setting and world, which I really dig. All of this just kind of results in a game that I am primed to enjoy. Like, I am ready, I am amped up to get into Soulframe. So when DE revealed that they would have this big showcase event hosting Soulframe's first official developer livestream at this year's TennoCon, dude, I was pumped, and I thought surely everyone else is gonna be pumped either. We're all gonna be super excited to get this like new fresh look at Soulframe. This game's coming out soon, right? Everyone's gonna be excited, hyped, super pumped for this game. Well, that's not exactly what happened. In fact, after the reveal of this new extended gameplay footage, many people were very much not pumped, quite the opposite, in fact. In just about every discussion thread that I read online, the comment sections were all predominantly negative. And the gameplay video itself was not only full of negative comments, but also sits at nearly a 50% dislike ratio. Now, even assuming that there's like a bias towards dislikes from the people who will download a extension for Chrome that shows YouTube dislikes, I can tell you from my own channel, from my own experience, that it's never that far off. Like, maybe it's off by a few percentage points, but not very much. It's typically in line with what the actual video stats are in terms of what you see in the extension, at least from my own experience, from my own channel. So what is everyone so upset about? Well, pretty much the gameplay. Almost universally, the complaints boil down to the look of the game. Here's some examples. I really hope this is still in very early development. The fighting and combat looks very rough. This can't be released with the current animations. They are honestly extremely subpar and thoroughly unenjoyable. Really digging the knife there. So basically, Warframe devs don't know how to do melee combat, question mark. One that personally made me chuckle a bit was this one that said, imagine being watched by all your ancestors just to miss that backstab with that animation, which is referring to one of the very first moments of combat actually showcased in the recent video, where the character goes up for the backstab and completely misses the target. Now, the animation starts fine, but then the sword somehow ends up far away from where it's supposed to be, not in the back, but to the side of the character. And that's just the start of things, really. Now, I gotta say, after watching back this showcase several times, I don't think these complaints are unjustified at all. Parts of the combat and character movement in particular do look pretty rough. Now, it's not all bad, but enough of it is clearly bad that it's worth mentioning by quite a few people, because there's been quite a lot of complaining, and the video has about 50% dislike ratio. So here's some examples of, I think, the things that stood out the most to me, where I think a lot of the criticism is coming from. So right away, you've got that very first encounter, right? The character goes up, they go into a stealth animation, they sneak around the back of this group, goes in for the backstab, and it does connect, mind you. You can see it. The NPC reacts, and the NPC loses health, but then the animation just completely whiffs it, like ending up beside its target rather than inside of the back of its target. I don't know how this happened, but it did, right? So completely whiffed backstab animation. Okay. Shortly after that, we then see the character do this dodge roll, and there seems to be a sliding of like a few extra meters further beyond the distance of the actual roll animation itself, as if the character is like gliding on ice. The whole thing feels off, and there are moments like this all throughout the video where the movement looks very floaty. The character is sliding around, and so are enemy NPCs, and I think this is probably one of the primary points where the complaints about gameplay is stemming from. Something about how the character and the enemies move at times feels incredibly disconnected from the environment. There's like a lack of groundedness to the whole thing. But you know what this movement reminds me almost exactly of? Warframe. Surprise, surprise. This sliding movement of the character looks and feels almost identical to what you see in Warframe. I just think that it doesn't much matter to people in that game since the pacing of the movement is so fast. Your character is sliding, double jumping, flying through the air at high velocity, rolling all over the place, doing ninja moves off of the environment, sprinting, dashing, dodging everywhere. Just the speed of that game is so quick that this sort of gliding and the floatiness is almost a feature of the movement, not a problem with it. But in this slower paced setting, sliding all over the place, far beyond where the animations would naturally place the character, it does look very out of place. It just looks bad. And again, I think this is where a lot of the criticism and complaints about this doesn't look good. I think a lot of it is stemming from that. But that's not everything. There were a few other parts of the gameplay sequence that looked off-putting that I think are also raising a lot of criticism. In the player's first encounter with the boss Nimrod, we see them do a double jump and fire off a bow attack from mid-air. Now, after landing, all of a sudden the camera is just right up on the player, like allowing for barely any awareness of the surroundings, to the point where the player then gets struck by this lightning attack that they couldn't see in time because that camera was so close. What I don't know here, though, is if this camera distance was actually moved by the player, the person controlling the character, to try to like highlight the boss animations for this showcase, which is entirely possible, or if this camera closeness was automated by the game when the player target locked onto the boss. If it is the latter, that is no good. It is way too close, and they need to pull this thing back a bit, because you can't not see like your surroundings and get struck by lightning because of it. That's not great, especially if most of the time you can be a bit further back. Also, during parts of this sequence and following encounters with the boss, it's just hard to make out what's even happening. Now, that is partially because the camera is so close, but then also you've got things like the fog, the haze, the lighting effects, and lens flare from attacks from both the boss and the player that just really clutter up the whole thing. Certainly, this video's bitrate doesn't help much either. That's a bit of a mess. It's like the bitrate and the compression and processing that happened on YouTube. I don't know. This thing is like a blurry mess across the board. That doesn't help, but really the lack of visual clarity and the visual clutter is mostly due to the stuff that's baked into the game. And I think this is another major sticking point for a lot of people. I mean, again, I look at parts of this boss fight and I'm like, what is happening? Like, you can barely see the boss a lot of the time with the lightning flares and the particle effects and the fog and the debris flying everywhere, and then the lens flare popping off the player's shoulder, and when they fire off attacks, and when the boss fires off the attacks, there's just this big, heavy amounts of visual clutter. The camera being really close doesn't help that much much either. But yeah, as mentioned earlier, though, I don't think it's all bad, and I do think many parts of the combat look perfectly fine, if not actually good. Particularly the player making attacks, the blocking, the shield slam. Like, yes, it could use a little more oomph. There's a kind of lightness to it all. We could get a more sense of weight would be nice, and I do think there was definitely some alignment issues, but this portion of the gameplay, a lot of those basic fundamentals of combat seems decent enough. Again, I really think the biggest issues and where a lot of these complaints are stemming from are mostly that floaty on ice feeling of the character movement, which just feels right in line with what I'm familiar with in Warframe. That heavy amount of visual clutter, not helped with the camera being up so tight for parts of it. And then a few standout rough animations. There was some stiffness to the character, like the character sprinting speed. Funnily enough, I thought the jogging animation looked good, but once they went into a sprint, it's like it was a robot all of a sudden. And that backstab animation completely whiffing. And there's a few others in there, like the character line lining up attacks and like their feet sliding. But again, that kind of goes into the movement thing. And I do wonder, there's a connectedness between these two games, but they are running their own set of animations. They've got an entirely new animation system that they're using for movement and combat. The developer has talked about this, but clearly running on the same engine and I guess running off the backbone of Warframe, there is a big cross-pollination happening here, and that floatiness to the movement is one of the biggest, most obvious indicators of that here. Because yeah, that looks just like a lot of the movement in Warframe with your character sliding all over the place, but it just kind of works in that game, right? I think because of the pacing, because of the speed. Now, that is the stuff that really stands out to me, the bigger issues, and where, again, I think a lot of the criticisms and complaints are coming from this gameplay showcase. Now, all that said, allow me to engage in a bit of copium here, okay? Partially because of DE's track record, supporting and updating Warframe for going on 12 years now, this game continues to be one of the most popular ongoing live service titles. It is consistently in the top 20 concurrent players on all of Steam. Not bad for being over a decade old. That certainly goes without saying. But then also because I love so much of what they've shown. Like beyond these issues with gameplay, pretty much everything else about the game I think looks great. The setting, the tone, and the world building. The characters, like that cute little turtle that we saw in the last gameplay showcase. The new rat queen, I think she's awesome. And your giant wolf companion. The style and appearance of the environment, like the player character and the NPCs. For me, a lot of this stuff, they've just knocked it out of the park. Like so much about what they've shown of Soulframe is right up my alley. Like I can't wait to try this game out. But the gameplay is pretty much number one, top of the list of priorities of importance for me. So I am hoping that they take this feedback, that they improve on the issues that people are pointing out. But mainly, I just hope it actually feels good to play, because I want to make a note of this here. How a game feels when you play it versus how it looks in a video isn't always one for one. Throne and Liberty is a great recent example of it. Throne and Liberty is a great looking game. It is very pretty, certainly. It's got pretty awesome looking animations, but boy, it feels pretty rough, like ranking amongst the worst feeling implementations of tab target I've played in an MMO. A heavy amount of clunkiness to that game and just does not feel smooth at all. It's not very enjoyable compared to other iterations of tab targeting that I've played. So maybe Soulframe is the case where playing it feels great. It's not looking so great on these early gameplay showcases. That is certainly a possibility. I think another thing to consider here is that it is still very early days for Soulframe. The game has, after all, only been in development for 2.5 years. We learned this shortly after Soulframe was revealed, when Steve Sinclair stated that they had only been working on the game at the point of the reveal for roughly 6 months. So we're at 2.5 years. That is not a very long time as far as like game development timelines go, especially for games like this shared world MMO-lite live service game. Most of these spend 4 to 5 years in development before we actually see them in action, before we actually see like honest to goodness gameplay. So 2.5 years in, I wouldn't say this looks all too bad. Now, we do know that timeline's a bit accelerated because they are building off of Warframe, but nevertheless, the point still stands. It's pretty early days for Soulframe. You could argue they shouldn't have showed it this early, but we can't argue that it's not still pretty early days. If we're looking at typical development timelines for video games, 2.5 years, it ain't much. I think part of what we're seeing here actually is just Digital Extreme's willingness to get players involved in the earlier stages of development. This is exactly what they did with Warframe. That game was very rough when it first came out, but many people still enjoyed the core foundation, myself included. And they've said that they were going to do as much again with Soulframe. When they announced it, they said, hey, we're going to bring people in pretty early. In fact, they have been running limited tests, which they call preludes, for several months now. People have been playing this game. These are essentially vertical slices of Soulframe to let a small pool of players test out and play around with some early systems and features. From what I've been able to tell, they've been testing like a very limited portion of the open world, some of the procedural dungeon systems, the things like the event system where roaming bosses move around the world, and some character progression, but it is still very much a limited in its size and scope. Nobody's playing the entire game right now, I guess maybe except for the developer themselves. Now, during TennoCon, they announced that these prelude tests will be going completely open to anyone who wants to try them sometime later this year. Now, that could be a mistake. After all, you only get one chance to make a good first impression, although I just get the sense that DE isn't much worried. Maybe that changes after the reception that they've gotten to this recent gameplay reveal, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe they're confident enough in where they're going to land with the end product that they are fine opening up testing for all, even if the game still has years of development left to go before it gets anywhere near a 1.0 release. I'll say though, regardless of how rough parts of the combat looked in this most recent video, I am still very keen to check out the game. There is a lot about what they're putting together here that I really like, and I think Digital Extremes does have a good track record in Warframe. At least it has for me as a player, a person who's come back over the years to check out all the new stuff. I mean, I spent some money like 8 years ago in Warframe. I bought some packs, some cash shop stuff, right? I bought some frames. But since then, I've pretty much not spent a dime in like 8 straight years, but I've still just about every year gone back and checked out all these updates for free, playing for a couple of weeks at a time. That's been pretty good for me. It's been a pretty good return on investment, right? I don't know what the hardcore player base thinks about Warframe nowadays, but I know for me, as a casual, as a revisiting player, I've quite enjoyed it. I like what they're doing with Soulframe. I like the premise, the tone, the setting they're going for. If they can nail the gameplay feel, despite how it might look in these gameplay videos, if they can nail the feel, polish it up, get everything else right, this could be another winner. It's certainly very appealing to me, just the general pitch of it, right? The general thing that they're presenting, I find very appealing. So if they can nail how it feels, the gameplay, and then the systems, features, the replayable content, the progression systems, that would be great. Hoping for the best. We will find out soon enough. Like we said, Soulframe Preludes testing will be open for all at some point in the coming months, and I'll be sure to report back in once I finally get my hands on the game. That does it for this video. Thank you all for watching. What do you think of Soulframe? What do you think of the recent reveal? And do you have any hope for the game going forward? Let me know. All right, thanks guys. I'll see you next time.